I don't need another goddamn nurse hovering over me like I'm some helpless child. Maxwell Reed's voice thundered through the cavernous master bedroom of his Newport mansion. The fine crystal tumbler in his hand shook slightly, betraying the weakness he so desperately tried to hide. Dr. Lawrence remained unfazed, having weathered these storms before. You fired 3 nurses in the past month, Max. This isn't sustainable. Your condition requires. My condition is my business. Maxwell cut him off, setting the tumbler down on the antique side table with enough force to make the ice cubes clink in protest. I built a multi-billion-dollar empire from nothing. I think I can manage my own health. The new nurse arrives today, Dr. Lawrence continued as if Maxwell hadn't spoken. Eliza Winters. Her references are impeccable. Special training in palliative care. Maxwell's jaw tightened at the word palliative. So she specializes in watching people die. She specializes in dignity. Max, something you might want to consider. Outside the gates of the Reed estate, Eliza Winters paid the cab driver and collected her modest suitcase. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen more than her fair share of life's harsh realities. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, her clothes simple but professional. The only touch of personality was a vintage silver brooch pinned to her cardigan, a family heirloom from her grandmother. Mrs. Harlow, the stern-faced housekeeper, greeted Eliza with a perfunctory handshake. "Mr. Reed is having a difficult morning," she warned as they walked through the impressive foyer. "He doesn't warm to new people easily." "I've dealt with difficult patients before," Eliza replied. Mrs. Harlow gave her a look that spoke volumes. "Not like him, you haven't." The mansion was a maze of opulence, priceless art adorning walls, antiques that belonged in museums, views of the Atlantic that property developers would kill for. But Eliza noticed other things too. The strategic placement of grab bars disguised as decorative elements, the subtle widening of doorways to accommodate a wheelchair if needed, the elevator discreetly installed behind what appeared to be an ordinary door. When they reached the master suite, Dr. Lawrence was exiting, looking exhausted. He brightened slightly at the sight of Eliza. "Ms. Winters, thank God you're here. I've briefed you on the medical details, but I should warn you that I won't last 3 days." Eliza finished for him with a small smile. Mrs. Harlow mentioned Mr. Reed can be challenging. "Challenging is putting it mildly," Dr. Lawrence sighed. "The experimental treatment we're trying has a real chance of extending his life, maybe even pushing him toward remission, but he needs consistent care, monitoring for side effects." "I understand my responsibilities, Doctor." Dr. Lawrence lowered his voice. Max wasn't always like this. The diagnosis changed him. He handed her a medical file. "Call me anytime, day or night." Eliza took a deep breath and entered the bedroom. The space was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean. Maxwell Reed sat in a leather chair by the window, his back to her. Even seated, there was something commanding about his presence. "Mr. Reed? I'm Eliza Winters, your new nurse." He didn't turn immediately. When he did, Eliza met piercing blue eyes set in a face that still retained traces of the handsome man featured on countless magazine covers, now gaunt from illness and treatment. "How long will you last, Ms. Winters?" "My money's on 3 days," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Eliza set her medical bag down calmly. "Long enough to provide the care you need, Mr. Reed. Shall we start by checking your vitals?" For a moment, surprise flickered across his face, as if he'd expected her to be intimidated. "You're wasting your time. And mine." "Time is exactly what we're trying to give you more of," Eliza replied, pulling out her stethoscope. "Your cooperation would make that easier, but it's not required." Something in her tone, professional yet unyielding, made Maxwell study her more carefully. "You're different from the others." "I'm precisely like the others, Mr. Reed. A qualified nurse here to do my job. The difference is, I don't intend to let your attitude prevent me from doing it properly." For the first time in months, Maxwell Reed felt something other than anger or despair. Curiosity. Eliza moved efficiently around the room, organizing medications, reviewing his chart, checking the equipment. There was something soothing about her methodical presence, though he'd never admit it. "The experimental protocol requires strict timing," she said, measuring a dose. "Dr. Lawrence mentioned you've been inconsistent. Playing guinea pig gets tedious. Dying tends to be tedious too, from what I've observed." Eliza responded without missing a beat. Maxwell's laugh was rusty, as if the sound surprised even him. "Well, Ms. Winters, you might make it to day 4 after all." The battle lines were drawn. Neither of them knew it yet, but their lives had just changed forever. A week into her employment at the Reed Mansion, Eliza had established a rigorous routine. Maxwell's medications were administered on schedule, his meals strictly followed the prescribed diet, and his physical therapy sessions were conducted despite his protests. The mansion staff watched with barely concealed amazement as Maxwell's cutting remarks bounced off her professional armor. "Tell me, Ms. Winters, do you practice that robot face in the mirror?" Maxwell asked one morning as she checked his blood pressure. "Or were you born without the ability to be offended?" "My job is to keep you alive, Mr. Reed, not to entertain your attempts at provocation," Eliza replied, making a note in his chart. "Your blood pressure is elevated again. Perhaps you should save your energy for healing instead of crafting insults." Something that might have been respect flickered in Maxwell's eyes. That night, Eliza was awakened by an alarm from the monitoring system she'd installed in her room. Maxwell's heart rate was elevated. She rushed down the hallway to his suite, finding the bed empty. Panic surged through her until she noticed light spilling from the partially open bathroom door. Maxwell was on the floor, trying to pull himself up using the counter, his face pale with pain and exertion. "What happened?" Eliza asked, rushing to his side. "What does it look like?" Maxwell snapped. "I needed the bathroom and decided the floor looked comfortable." Eliza bit back a retort as she helped him up, noticing how he tried to minimize physical contact, maintaining dignity even now. Once he was steady, she stepped back, respecting his space. "You should have called for assistance. That's why I'm here. I've been going to the bathroom by myself for over 40 years. I'm not about to stop now because of this inconvenience." Eliza caught the slight break in his voice on the last word. The diagnosis, terminal unless the experimental treatment worked, was an inconvenience to Maxwell Reed. "Next time, use the call button," she said firmly. Later that night, Eliza was reviewing his medical history when the call button finally lit up. She found Maxwell fully dressed, sitting on the edge of his bed. "I need to go to the observatory," he stated, as if daring her to refuse. "It's 2 a.m., Mr. Reed. Insomnia is listed in my chart as a side effect. I might as well make use of the sleepless hours." He attempted to stand, his knuckles white as he gripped his cane. Eliza considered the situation. She could force him back to bed, cite medical protocols, but something in his expression stopped her. This wasn't mere stubbornness. This was a man desperately seeking connection to something beyond his illness. "Where is this observatory?" she asked finally. Maxwell looked genuinely surprised. "You're not going to lecture me about rest? Would it make a difference if I did?" The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Top floor, North Tower." The observatory was unlike anything Eliza had imagined. A glass dome revealed the night sky, and an antique telescope stood ready on its mount. The space was immaculate, unlike the dusty attic she had expected. "This is breathtaking," she admitted. "It's the one place I can still feel." Maxwell trailed off, moving to the telescope with surprising agility. "Come here. Jupiter is visible tonight." Eliza approached cautiously, aware they were crossing some undefined boundary. When she bent to look through the eyepiece, she gasped softly. Jupiter's bands were clearly visible, along with 3 tiny moons. "The 4th moon is behind the planet right now," Maxwell explained, his voice different, softer, almost reverent. "My father built this observatory when I was a child, before he lost everything." Eliza straightened, studying him in the dim light. "You come here often?" "Whenever I need perspective." He adjusted the telescope slightly. Hard to focus on quarterly reports when you're looking at something that's been spinning for billions of years. An unexpected silence fell between them, not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. Eliza realized this was the first genuine conversation they'd had that wasn't about medications or symptoms. "My father taught astronomy at Brown before the market crash took everything." Maxwell continued unexpectedly. "After he abandoned us, this was all I had left of him. I rebuilt the telescope piece by piece while putting myself through college." Eliza saw a different man in that moment, not the billionaire tyrant the media portrayed, but someone who had known loss and had fought back. "Sometimes the things that hurt us most also shape us," she said quietly. Maxwell's gaze sharpened on her face. "You sound like you speak from experience, Ms. Winters. Everyone has their stories, Mr. Reed." but not everyone carries them with such composure. He turned back to the telescope. Neptune should be visible as well. Would you like to see? They spent an hour in the observatory, the usual barriers between patient and caregiver temporarily suspended among the stars. When Maxwell finally showed signs of fatigue, Eliza gently suggested they return to his room. As she helped him navigate the stairs, his hand briefly gripped hers with surprising strength. "This stays between us, Ms. Winters. I have a reputation for being an impossible patient to maintain. Your secret is safe with me, Mr. Reed." Though your momentary display of humanity was quite shocking. That startled a genuine laugh from him, rough and unpracticed, but real. The next morning, their routine resumed as if nothing had changed. But something had shifted, imperceptible to anyone watching but profound nonetheless. A tiny crack had formed in the crystal walls Maxwell had built around himself, and through it, Eliza caught her first glimpse of the man behind the billionaire facade, a man who found solace in distant planets and ancient light. 3 weeks into her stay at the Reed Mansion, Eliza discovered the grand piano in the music room. During a rare moment of downtime while Maxwell napped, she wandered the east wing, drawn by the afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows. The piano stood like a sleeping giant, its polished ebony surface untouched by time or dust. Eliza glanced over her shoulder before approaching it. Mrs. Harlow had mentioned certain rooms were off-limits, though she hadn't specified which ones. Her fingers hovered over the ivory keys, remembering the hours spent practicing in her childhood home, her mother guiding her hands with patient determination. She pressed a key softly. The note rang clear and true, perfectly tuned despite apparent disuse. Emboldened, Eliza sat on the bench and began to play a Chopin nocturne, her mother's favorite. The music filled the space, melancholy yet beautiful. Eliza closed her eyes, momentarily transported from the mansion and its troubles to simpler times. "You play like her." Eliza's hands froze above the keys. She turned to find Maxwell standing in the doorway, leaning on his cane. She rose quickly, embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." "Continue," he interrupted. "Please." She hesitated, studying his expression for signs of the usual irritation. Instead, she found something else, a vulnerability that made him appear younger. Eliza returned to the bench and resumed playing. From the corner of her eye, she watched Maxwell enter the room and lower himself carefully into a wingback chair. He closed his eyes, his expression softening as the notes filled the air. When the piece ended, a respectful silence hung between them. "My mother loved Chopin," Maxwell finally said. "This piano hasn't been played since she died. I was 12. Eliza's hands rested gently on the keys. "My mother taught me this piece before she passed. She said music speaks when words fail." "What happened to her?" Maxwell asked. "Cancer. I was in college." Eliza traced a key with her finger. "That's when I decided to become a nurse." Maxwell nodded slowly. "So you chose to surround yourself with what took her from you." "I chose to help others navigate what my family went through alone." Eliza met his gaze steadily. "Sometimes the best healing comes from facing what hurts us most." Something shifted in Maxwell's eyes. Recognition, perhaps. He gestured toward the piano. "Do you know Nocturne number 20 in C-sharp minor?" Eliza smiled slightly. "It was the first piece I mastered." As she played, Maxwell's eyes remained closed, his fingers lightly tapping against the armrest in time with the music. When she finished, he opened a cabinet near his chair, revealing an extensive vinyl collection. "My mother's records," he explained. "No one's touched them since." "Would you like to listen to one?" Eliza asked gently. That afternoon marked the beginning of a new routine. Every day after Maxwell's rest period, they would meet in the music room. Sometimes Eliza played. Other times they listened to the vintage records, the crackling vinyl adding texture to the compositions. During these sessions, Maxwell began to share fragments of his life, not the public persona splashed across business magazines, but memories of a boy who lost his mother too young, whose father crumbled under financial ruin, who worked his way through MIT on scholarships while sleeping in a shared apartment with 4 roommates. "The media loves the story of the ruthless billionaire," he said one day as Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata played softly. "They're less interested in the decade of 18-hour workdays and failed prototypes." "People prefer simple narratives," Eliza replied. "Heroes and villains are easier to understand than complex human beings." Maxwell studied her with curiosity. And which am I in your narrative, Miss Winters? I haven't decided yet, she answered honestly. You have qualities of both. This startled a laugh from him. Refreshingly blunt. Professional assessment, she corrected with a small smile. As the days passed, Maxwell began asking about her life. Initially reluctant, Eliza gradually shared her own story. Losing her parents in a car accident during her sophomore year of college, working double shifts to complete her nursing degree, the fiancé who left when she chose palliative care as her specialty. He said he couldn't compete with the dying, she admitted, eyes on the piano keys. That I gave more compassion to strangers than to him. Was he right? Maxwell asked. Eliza's hand stilled. Perhaps. It's easier sometimes, with patience. There are boundaries, protocols, clear beginning and end points. She glanced at him. Relationships with the living are messy, eh? Yet you chose a specialty surrounded by death. It's not about death, Eliza corrected. It's about dignity at the end, making moments count when they're limited. That evening, during his medication routine, Maxwell surprised her by extending his arm for the injection without the usual resistance. The nausea from this one is particularly unpleasant, she warned as she prepared the dose. I'm aware, he replied drily. I've been meaning to ask, is this treatment actually working, or am I simply prolonging the inevitable with these chemical cocktails? Eliza's movements remained steady as she administered the injection. Dr. Lawrence believes there's reason for cautious optimism. Your last blood work showed improved markers. Maxwell absorbed this with an unreadable expression. Cautious optimism. What a delightfully non-committal phrase. Would you prefer false certainty? No. His voice softened unexpectedly. No, I appreciate honesty, Ms. Winters. It's refreshingly rare in my world. As she secured the bandage over the injection site, her fingers lingered briefly on his arm. A momentary, unprofessional gesture of comfort that surprised them both. The small act of human connection hung between them, neither acknowledging it aloud. That night, Maxwell permitted her to adjust his pain medication for the first time, a small but significant surrender of control that spoke volumes. The weather forecast had predicted light showers, but the storm that descended on Newport that April evening was anything but gentle. Wind howled through the century-old oak trees surrounding the Reed estate, sending branches scraping against windows like desperate fingers seeking entry. Rain fell in violent sheets, transforming the manicured gardens into miniature lakes. Eliza checked the emergency generators twice, ensuring Maxwell's medical equipment would remain operational if the power failed. The mansion staff had already departed for the day, leaving only Mrs. Harlow, who lived in the guest house, and the security team stationed at the gate. The coastal road is flooded, Maxwell observed from his study window, watching lightning illuminate the churning Atlantic. We're effectively cut off until morning. The emergency protocols are in place, Eliza assured him. Your medication schedule won't be disrupted. Maxwell turned from the window with an appraising look. Always the professional, Ms. Winters. Do you ever allow yourself to be affected by anything? Before she could respond, the mansion plunged into darkness. The backup generators kicked in seconds later, but only emergency lighting and essential medical equipment received power. The heating system remained offline. Well, this should test those emergency protocols of yours, Maxwell remarked. The temperature dropped rapidly as wind found every draft in the old mansion. Eliza located extra blankets in the linen closet and brought them to Maxwell's room, where the medical monitoring equipment created an island of dim light in the darkness. Your core temperature needs to remain stable, she explained, arranging the blankets. The treatment makes you more susceptible to complications from cold. Maxwell watched her efficient movements. There are 3 vacation properties in my portfolio available at a moment's notice. Yet here we are, facing potential hypothermia in a 28-room mansion. Would you prefer I call your pilot to fire up the private jet in the middle of a northeastern gale? Eliza asked drily. This startled a genuine laugh from him. Fair point. Eliza eyed the ornate fireplace that dominated one wall of the master bedroom. Is this functional or merely decorative? Fully operational. There should be firewood in the... I'll find it, she interrupted, already heading for the door. When she returned with an armload of split logs, Maxwell had moved from his bed to a leather armchair nearer the fireplace. He looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable without his usual backdrop of wealth and power. Eliza knelt to arrange the logs, aware of his gaze on her back. You're fortunate to have a traditional fireplace. Most modern homes rely entirely on central heating. This house was built in 1891. My great-grandfather brought in craftsmen from Europe for the stonework. Maxwell's voice took on a different quality when he spoke of family history. Less sharp, more contemplative. Every regeneration has added something to the property. I renovated the east wing and built the technology lab in the old carriage house. The fire caught, flames licking eagerly at the seasoned oak. Warmth began to push back the chill as Eliza arranged pillows and blankets closer to the hearth. What are you doing? Maxwell asked. Creating a warmer area for you to rest. Your bed is too far from the heat source. You're suggesting I sleep on the floor? Like some kind of wilderness survival scenario. Eliza straightened, hands on hips. I'm suggesting you avoid hypothermia. Your immune system is already compromised. Maxwell studied the makeshift arrangement, then the increasing fury of the storm outside his windows. I suppose this beats freezing to death in Egyptian cotton sheets. Another crack of lightning illuminated the room, followed immediately by a thunderclap that shook the window panes. Eliza flinched involuntarily. Don't tell me the unflappable Ms. Winters is afraid of storms, Maxwell observed, his tone lacking its usual edge. Not afraid, Eliza countered, adjusting a blanket unnecessarily. Respectful of their power. Come sit by the fire, Maxwell said unexpectedly. You're shivering. Eliza hesitated, acutely aware of crossing another boundary in their carefully maintained professional relationship. Yet the practicality of sharing the fire's warmth outweighed protocol concerns. She settled on the opposite side of the hearth, maintaining a respectful distance. Have you ever experienced a hurricane? Maxwell asked as another thunderclap shook the house. Never directly, no. I was caught in one off the Cayman Islands about 10 years ago. My yacht's captain warned me to postpone the trip, but I had an important meeting. He trailed off, staring into the flames. The storm drove us off course for 2 days. I watched 100-foot waves crash over the bow and realized how utterly insignificant all my wealth and influence was to nature. Eliza wrapped her arms around her knees, absorbing both his words and the fire's warmth. Did it change you? Temporarily, he admitted with a self-deprecating smile. The humility lasted about as long as it took to close my next acquisition. As the night progressed, the formal distance between them softened. Maxwell shared stories of business triumphs and spectacular failures, while Eliza spoke of challenging cases and patients who had changed her perspective on life and death. Why palliative care? Maxwell asked during a lull in conversation. Most medical professionals focus on curing, not managing the inevitable. Eliza gazed into the fire. Because the end of life deserves as much attention as its beginning. Because dignity matters, especially when everything else is being stripped away. Maxwell was quiet for a long moment. Is that what you're doing here? Ensuring my dignity remains intact as everything else fails. Her eyes met his across the flickering light. Is that what you want from me? I don't know what I want anymore, he admitted, the confession clearly costing him. Except perhaps not to be alone when the time comes. The raw honesty of his statement hung between them. Eliza felt something shift, a deepening of connection that transcended their professional roles. You won't be, she promised softly. They fell asleep beside the fire, separated by just a few feet of carpet and a lifetime of different experiences, yet somehow meeting in the shared human territory of vulnerability. When morning broke and staff returned to a mansion miraculously unscathed by the storm, they found Maxwell back in his bed and Eliza professionally checking his vitals, as if the night's unusual intimacy had never occurred. But something fundamental had changed, and they both knew it. The established routine between Eliza and Maxwell was shattered by the sound of Italian leather heels clicking purposefully across the marble foyer. Mrs. Harlow appeared at the door of the music room, her usually impassive face betraying rare discomfort. Mr. Reed, Mrs. Reed has arrived. Maxwell's fingers, which had been absently tapping along to Eliza's rendition of Debussy, froze mid-motion. Vanessa is here. Before Mrs. Harlow could respond, a woman swept into the room like a perfectly tailored hurricane. Tall and elegantly thin, with expertly highlighted blonde hair, and the kind of refined beauty that spoke of both good genes and better surgeons. Vanessa Reed commanded attention the moment she entered a space. "Maxie, darling," she exclaimed, crossing the room in long strides. "The moment James told me about your condition, I dropped everything in Milan and flew straight back." Eliza watched Maxwell transform before her eyes. His shoulders tensed, his expression shuddered, and the relaxed demeanor he'd gradually developed in her presence vanished, replaced by the cold mask she'd first encountered weeks ago. "Vanessa," he acknowledged stiffly, "this is unexpected. Don't be ridiculous. How could I stay away?" Vanessa bent to kiss his cheek, leaving a perfect lip imprint that marked her territory. Her gaze finally acknowledged Eliza's presence, sweeping over her with dismissive assessment. "And who is this?" "Ms. Winters is my nurse," Maxwell replied, his tone neutral. "Oh, of course." Vanessa's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Well, you can take a break now. I'm here." Eliza maintained her professional composure. "Mr. Reed has treatment scheduled in 30 minutes. I should prepare his medication." "How efficient," Vanessa remarked. Maxie always did prefer punctuality in his staff. The diminutive nickname grated against everything Eliza had come to know about Maxwell. The man she'd grown to respect would never allow such infantilization. "I'll be in the treatment room when you're ready, Mr. Reed," Eliza said, gathering her dignity as she left. In the medication prep area, Eliza consulted Maxwell's chart with forced concentration, trying to ignore the unsettled feeling that Vanessa's arrival had triggered. As his nurse, she had no right to opinions about his personal relationships. Mrs. Harlow appeared silently at her side. "She'll be moving into the blue suite," the housekeeper said, her tone carefully neutral. "She's brought quite a lot of luggage." "I wasn't aware Mr. Reed was expecting guests." "He wasn't." Mrs. Harlow's thin lips pressed together. "The first Mrs. Reed rarely requires an invitation." Eliza prepared the injection with steady hands. "Their divorce was finalized years ago, correct?" 5 years. But she maintains significant holdings in his companies." Mrs. Harlow hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "Things ended messily. The staff doesn't speak of it." Over the following days, Vanessa established herself as a dominant presence in the mansion. She reorganized meal schedules, questioned treatment protocols, and conducted lengthy business calls in rapid-fire French or Italian from various rooms. Designer packages arrived daily, and a retinue of assistants drifted in and out of the property, cluttering the once peaceful environment with urgent demands. Maxwell became increasingly withdrawn, his recent progress seeming to evaporate in Vanessa's presence. The music room session stopped. The observatory remained locked. He answered Eliza's medical questions with clipped responses, avoiding the conversations that had become a meaningful part of their days. One afternoon, as Eliza administered his treatment, she noticed his hands trembling more than usual. "You're experiencing increased side effects," she noted. "Are you sleeping properly?" "I'm fine," he replied curtly. "Your body's response suggests otherwise." Maxwell glanced toward the door, confirming they were alone. "Vanessa's presence is complicating things. Would you like me to adjust your medication schedule to better accommodate her visits?" "Her visits?" Maxwell repeated with a bitter laugh. "She's here for the long haul, Ms. Winters. At least until she secures what she wants." "And what is that?" He met her eyes directly for the first time in days. "Control of my companies. She thinks my condition makes me vulnerable to manipulation." "Does it?" Eliza asked, professional boundaries momentarily forgotten. "It makes me more determined to protect what I've built." His jaw tightened, "especially now that I understand its true value." Their conversation was interrupted by Vanessa's entrance. She paused, taking in their proximity with calculating eyes. "Am I interrupting something?" she asked sweetly. "Just routine treatment," Eliza replied, stepping back. "Good. Max and I have business to discuss. Financial matters." Vanessa waved dismissively. "You can finish later." "The treatment can't be interrupted once started," Eliza said firmly. "It requires continuous monitoring for another 20 minutes. Vanessa's perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched. "My, aren't we dedicated?" "Very well, I'll wait." She settled into a chair, making it clear she wasn't leaving. That evening, Eliza accidentally overheard a heated exchange while delivering Maxwell's evening medication to his study. Vanessa's voice carried through the partially open door. "You still haven't signed the transfer documents, Max, she said impatiently. The board meeting is next week. I'm not signing anything until I review every detail. Maxwell responded coldly, especially given what I discovered about Ridgeline Pharmaceuticals. Ancient history, Vanessa dismissed. The board needs stability and clear succession planning. Your condition. My condition doesn't affect my judgment, Maxwell interrupted. I know exactly what you're trying to do, Vanessa. Eliza retreated silently, troubled by the exchange. The next morning, she found Vanessa observing her closely as she prepared Maxwell's medications. How long have you been a nurse, Ms. Winters? Vanessa asked with deceptive casualness. 10 years. And how long do you typically stay with patients in Maxwell's situation? Eliza measured the medication carefully. Each case is different. Of course. Vanessa fingered an expensive pendant at her throat. It must be difficult, becoming attached to patients who inevitably leave your care one way or another. The implication was clear, but Eliza refused to engage. I focus on providing the best possible care for however long it's needed. Admirable, Vanessa said, her smile not reaching her eyes. Though I wonder if your attachment to this particular patient has crossed professional boundaries. Eliza met her gaze steadily. My only concern is Mr. Reed's well-being. Then we share the same priority, don't we? Vanessa's voice hardened slightly. I've known Max for 20 years. I understand what he needs far better than someone who arrived a few weeks ago. After that conversation, small accidents began to occur. Eliza's medication schedule was mysteriously altered in the system. Her patient notes went missing. Her room was accidentally entered and searched by housekeeping. Maxwell seemed oblivious to these occurrences, increasingly absorbed in business matters and lengthy private meetings with his lawyers. The easy rapport they had developed was replaced by formal, stilted interactions under Vanessa's watchful eye. Determined to understand the dynamics at play, Eliza used her day off to research Maxwell Reed and Vanessa Harrington Reed. The local library's internet access provided anonymity that the mansion's monitored network couldn't offer. Headlines painted a clear picture of their relationship. Tech titan weds socialite in Hampton ceremony. Power couple acquires biotech startup. Reed marriage ends in $200 million settlement. More interesting were the business articles detailing their corporate entanglements. Vanessa retained significant board positions and stock options in several Reed subsidiaries. A more recent article caught Eliza's attention. Reed Innovations faces scrutiny over Ridgeline acquisition. The piece detailed allegations that Reed's company had deliberately tanked Ridgeline Pharmaceuticals stock before acquisition, then stripped its assets and terminated pension obligations to hundreds of employees. Eliza dug deeper, finding forum posts from former Ridgeline employees describing lost retirement funds and healthcare coverage. The acquisition had occurred 5 years ago, coinciding with Maxwell and Vanessa's divorce. Rain pattered against the library windows as Eliza connected fragments of conversations she'd overheard. Maxwell's mention of Ridgeline during his argument with Vanessa, his increased focus on legal meetings, the tension surrounding document signings. Her research was interrupted by a text from Mrs. Harlow. Return immediately. Situation developing. Eliza found the mansion in controlled chaos. A medical emergency team was departing as she arrived, and Dr. Lawrence met her in the foyer. What happened? She demanded. Maxwell had an adverse reaction to his medication, Dr. Lawrence explained, frowning. Severe enough to require intervention, but he stabilized. That's impossible. The dosage hasn't changed in weeks. According to Mrs. Reed, you adjusted it yesterday. I did no such thing, Eliza said firmly. Where is he now? Resting. Mrs. Reed is with him. Eliza found Maxwell pale but alert, with Vanessa perched attentively at his bedside. The look Vanessa gave her contained unmistakable triumph. Ms. Winters, Maxwell acknowledged weakly. It seems we had a miscommunication about my medication. There was no miscommunication, Eliza stated. I need to review your chart. I've already discussed the incident with Dr. Lawrence. Vanessa interjected smoothly. Simple human error. It happens to the best of us. Eliza maintained her composure. I'd still like to speak with Mr. Reed privately about his treatment plan. He needs rest, not interrogation, Vanessa countered. Perhaps you should take the remainder of the day to collect yourself. Maxwell's eyes moved between the two women, his expression unreadable. A moment alone with Ms. Winters would be appropriate, Vanessa. With evident reluctance, Vanessa left the room, closing the door with unnecessary force. I didn't change your medication, Eliza said immediately. I know, Maxwell replied quietly. But someone altered the digital records. You need additional security measures for your treatment protocol. Maxwell studied her with tired eyes. Vanessa is many things, but she wouldn't risk my life. Are you certain? What's at stake here goes beyond normal divorce resentments. You've been investigating, he observed, not a question. I've been trying to understand what's happening in this house. Maxwell seemed to reach a decision. The Ridgeline acquisition was handled by Vanessa while I was recovering from back surgery. By the time I discovered the ethical breaches, hundreds of people had lost their pensions and medical coverage. He paused. I've spent the last 6 months secretly untangling the damage and preparing restitution, which would implicate Vanessa in securities fraud. And your diagnosis interrupted those plans. Created a more urgent timeline, he corrected. Vanessa knows if she can maintain control until... He hesitated. Until after, she can bury everything. The implications settled heavily between them. Eliza checked his vitals while processing this information. Your recovery is my priority, she finally said. The rest is outside my professional scope. Is it? Maxwell asked softly. You strike me as someone intimately familiar with justice, Ms. Winters. Their conversation was interrupted by an imperious knock. Vanessa re-entered without waiting for a response, followed by Dr. Lawrence. We need to discuss adjustments to Maxwell's care team, she announced. The following day, Eliza returned to the library, driven by an unsettling suspicion. She expanded her search to include victims of the Ridgeline collapse. Page after page of personal stories appeared, retirements destroyed, medical treatments abandoned, homes foreclosed. Then she found it, a small obituary. Eleanor Montgomery, 72, passed away from complications of untreated heart disease following loss of medical coverage in the Ridgeline bankruptcy. The room seemed to tilt. Eleanor Montgomery, her grandmother's name. The dates aligned perfectly with her grandmother's sudden deterioration and death while working as a housekeeper for a wealthy family in Rhode Island. Eliza's hands trembled as she pulled up another search. There it was, a staff photo from the Reed Estates charity gala 15 years ago. In the background, among the uniformed staff, stood her grandmother. Eleanor Montgomery had worked for the Reed family, the same Reed family whose business dealings had stripped her of the medical coverage that might have saved her life. That evening, Eliza was arranging medications when Vanessa entered the treatment room. We need to talk, Vanessa said, dispensing with pleasantries. Your relationship with my husband has become inappropriate. Ex-husband, Eliza corrected calmly. And my relationship with Mr. Reed is strictly professional. Vanessa laughed, the sound like breaking glass. Please, I recognize the signs. Max has always had a weakness for caretaker types. She moved closer. Let me be clear. You are a temporary employee in a situation that has a definitive end date. Is that a threat? It's a reality check. Vanessa's expression hardened. You clearly don't understand your place in this scenario. And what scenario is that exactly? Maxwell doesn't need a nurse who overreaches her position, Vanessa said coldly. Perhaps you should know exactly who you're working for. She extracted a folder from her designer tote and placed it on the counter. Educational material. After Vanessa departed, Eliza opened the folder with apprehension. Inside were internal memos regarding the Ridgeline acquisition, stock manipulation strategies, and pension fund termination plans, all bearing Maxwell's signature. The final page was a photograph, her grandmother in a Reed household uniform, pinning the silver brooch to her collar. The same brooch Eliza now wore daily. An attached note in elegant handwriting read, "Interesting how fate works. Your grandmother served the Reed family, never knowing it was Maxwell himself who destroyed her previous life. He's ruined hundreds of lives without a backward glance." That night, Maxwell asked Eliza to accompany him to the observatory. For the first time, she refused. "I'm not feeling well," she said formally. "I'll ask Mrs. Harlow to assist you." Confusion and hurt flashed across his face. "Have I done something to offend you?" "Not at all, Mr. Reed. I'm simply maintaining appropriate professional boundaries." In the days that followed, Eliza performed her duties with mechanical precision, avoiding the personal conversations that had become their norm. Maxwell watched this transformation with growing confusion that gradually hardened into resignation. When Eliza finally submitted her transfer request, citing personal conflicts, the rejection in Maxwell's eyes was palpable. She departed the Reed mansion on a quiet Sunday morning, leaving only a formal resignation letter with no explanation. What she didn't leave was her grandmother's brooch, which had somehow vanished from her room the night before. Its absence felt like a final severance of the connection to both her grandmother and the man she had begun to care for, a man who, according to the evidence, had contributed to her grandmother's death. 2 weeks after leaving the Reed mansion, Eliza immersed herself in work at Newport Community Hospital, accepting double shifts that left little time for reflection. Her colleagues noticed the shadows beneath her eyes and the absence of her usual composed smile, but respected her silence. Only the head nurse, Marion, dared to comment. "You're running yourself into the ground, Winters," she observed during a rare quiet moment in the oncology ward. "Whatever you're running from, it'll still be there when exhaustion catches up with you." Eliza adjusted a patient's foreline. "I'm not running from anything, just making up for time away." Marion replied skeptically. "That's why you jump every time someone mentions the Reed name." Before Eliza could respond, a nurse's aide approached. "There's someone asking for you at reception. Says he's Dr. Lawrence." Eliza found Maxwell's physician waiting in the small consultation room, his expression grave. "He stopped the experimental treatment," Lawrence said without preamble. "Refuses to continue since you left." Eliza maintained her professional demeanor despite the way her heart constricted. "He's an adult capable of making his own medical decisions." "You don't understand," Lawrence insisted, leaning forward. "The treatment was working. His latest scans showed tumor reduction. There's a genuine chance of remission." "Then explain that to him," Eliza replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm sure Mrs. Reed is providing adequate support during his treatment." Lawrence's expression darkened. "Vanessa is the reason I'm here." He glanced at his watch. "Can we speak somewhere private? There's more you need to know." At a coffee shop across from the hospital, Lawrence pulled out a tablet and entered a complex password. "What I'm about to show you violates several confidentiality agreements, but people's lives are at stake." He pulled up documents showing pharmaceutical trial results, board minutes, and email exchanges. Maxwell never knew about the unethical practices at Ridgeline. He was recovering from a severe skiing accident when that acquisition was finalized. Vanessa led the transition team and implemented the pension cuts and insurance terminations without his knowledge. "That's convenient," Eliza said, unconvinced. "He's the CEO. The documents I saw had his signature." "Signatures can be replicated, especially when you're married to someone." Lawrence swiped to another document. "This is from Maxwell's private investigation, launched 6 months ago when he discovered discrepancies in the Ridgeline financial reports." The document detailed evidence of forged authorizations, offshore accounts, and systematic fraud orchestrated by a team led by Vanessa. Maxwell had been building a case to present to federal authorities and establish a victim compensation fund. "His diagnosis accelerated everything," Lawrence continued. "He's been working frantically to complete the investigation before." He hesitated. "Before he dies," Eliza finished for him. "Before the treatment becomes ineffective," Lawrence corrected firmly. "Which brings me to the other reason I'm here. Maxwell listed you as his medical proxy in his updated healthcare directive. He signed it the day before you left." Eliza stared at him, stunned. "That's not appropriate. I'm not family." "He doesn't trust his family. Or his ex-wife. He trusts you." Lawrence's expression softened. "He said you were the only person who saw him as a man, not as a fortune or a medical case." Eliza's professional composure wavered. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Vanessa is about to be named conservator of his estate by the board. She's claiming his judgment is compromised by his condition and medication. Once that happens, the investigation ends, the compensation fund disappears, and hundreds of victims never see justice." Lawrence leaned forward. "Including your grandmother." Eliza froze. "How do you know about my grandmother?" "Maxwell discovered the connection last week. He's been searching for every affected family." Lawrence pulled up another document. Eleanor Montgomery, former pharmacist at Ridgeline's research division, lost her pension and health coverage in the acquisition. Later employed as housekeeper at the Reed estate. She died of heart complications that could have been treated with proper medical care, Eliza said quietly. "I know. And so does Maxwell now." Lawrence's voice softened. He didn't know, Eliza. The man I've treated for 15 years would never knowingly destroy lives like that. Rain streaked the coffee shop windows as Eliza absorbed this information, her professional training battling with personal emotions. Even if what you're saying is true, what does it have to do with me now? I've resigned my position. Because Maxwell is giving up. Lawrence's frustration showed through his professional veneer. He believes he deserved what's happening, that your departure was some kind of cosmic justice. He's surrendering to both the disease and Vanessa's machinations. That doesn't sound like the Maxwell Reed I knew, Eliza said before she could stop herself. The Maxwell Reed you knew is still there, but fading fast. Lawrence checked his phone. I need to get back to the hospital. There's one more thing you should know. The silver brooch you always wore? Maxwell found it in the observatory. That's impossible. It disappeared from my room the night before I left. Someone wanted to ensure it wasn't with you when you departed. Lawrence stood to leave. Maxwell's been trying to learn the brooch's history. He seems to think it's important. That evening, Eliza couldn't focus on her apartment's small comforts. Her mind kept returning to Maxwell. His vulnerability in the observatory, his passion for music, his dry humor during their late-night conversations. Those memories conflicted sharply with the corporate tyrant portrayed in the Ridgeline documents. She'd entered the Reed mansion expecting to find a difficult billionaire facing death with poor grace. Instead, she discovered a complex man confronting mortality with unexpected courage, working to right past wrongs before time ran out. Her phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. ER admission. MR condition critical. Lawrence. Eliza grabbed her keys without hesitation. At Newport Memorial, she found Maxwell in the critical care unit, pale and diminished against the white hospital sheets. Monitors beeped steadily, tracking vital signs that were stable but concerning. Vanessa was nowhere to be seen. Cardiac event. The attending physician explained when Eliza flashed her hospital credentials. Brought on by stress and treatment interruption. We've stabilized him, but it was close. Where is Mrs. Reed? Eliza asked. Left for New York once he was stabilized. Business emergency, apparently. The doctor's tone conveyed his opinion of such priorities. Eliza approached the bed cautiously. Maxwell looked vulnerable in hospital-issued garments, stripped of the trappings of wealth that usually surrounded him. His eyes opened slowly at her approach, disbelief crossing his features as recognition dawned. You came back, he murmured, voice rough from intubation. Just checking that you're not terrorizing the nursing staff, she replied, falling back on their familiar banter to mask her concern. Maxwell's hand moved slightly on the blanket, revealing something clutched in his palm. The silver brooch caught the fluorescent light. Your grandmother was extraordinary, he said softly. Like you. Eliza's professional facade cracked as he pressed the brooch into her hand. His fingers were cold, his grip weaker than she remembered. I found it in the observatory, he continued with effort. After you left, I started researching. Eleanor Montgomery wasn't just a housekeeper. She saved the Reed estate during the financial crisis that ruined my father. Stayed without pay for months while I was away at school. Kept the property running when everyone else abandoned it. He paused, gathering strength. More incredibly, she was an early investor in my first patents. Anonymous angel investor who never claimed her profits. His eyes held Eliza's. The same woman who later lost everything in the Ridgeline collapse that I didn't oversee. Dr. Lawrence showed me the documents, Eliza admitted. About Vanessa's involvement. I should have been paying attention, Maxwell said, regret evident. My name, my company. My responsibility, ultimately. You're trying to make it right. Eliza's hand closed around the brooch. That matters. Maxwell's gaze drifted to the window, where rain lashed against the glass. I found something else while you were gone. Files Vanessa tried to destroy. His voice strengthened with anger. She didn't just orchestrate Ridgeline's collapse. She manipulated documents to implicate me while diverting millions to offshore accounts. Dr. Lawrence entered with a tablet displaying test results. Your cardiac enzymes are elevated, but not critically. If you restart the experimental protocol immediately, we can mitigate the damage. Maxwell's eyes remained on Eliza. Will you stay this time? He asked quietly. Not as my nurse. As your partner, she completed, her hand finding his. The word encompassed something neither of them could fully articulate yet. Something beyond professional boundaries, but built on the foundation of mutual respect they'd established. As Lawrence updated Maxwell's treatment plan, Eliza felt the weight of the silver brooch in her hand, a tangible connection between past and present, between loss and possibility. Her grandmother's legacy now intertwined with her own future in ways she never could have imagined. While Maxwell underwent cardiac tests, Eliza examined the silver brooch in his private hospital suite. The Art Deco design with intertwined initials, EM, had been her constant companion through nursing school and her career, connecting her to the grandmother who raised her. Now it represented something more complex, a link to Maxwell and a history she'd never suspected. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Lawrence. Board meeting tomorrow. V pushing for conservatorship based on mental deterioration. Need counter-evidence. Eliza's nursing instincts kicked in. She needed documentation, not just emotional certainty. 3 hours later, with help from Marion and her paralegal husband, she had compiled a comprehensive timeline linking the Ridgeline acquisition, her grandmother's employment, and Maxwell's recent investigation. When Maxwell returned, color had returned to his face. The cardiology team is cautiously optimistic, he reported. Apparently, my stubborn refusal to die on schedule impresses them. His eyes moved to the papers spread across the table. You've been busy. I need to understand exactly what happened, Eliza said. Not just for my grandmother, but for myself. Fair enough. What do you want to know? Everything. Maxwell explained how his empire began with patents developed in MIT dorm rooms and maxed-out credit cards. He met Vanessa at a charity gala. She wanted social standing. He wanted European market access through her family connections. We were a power couple, according to the press, he recalled without nostalgia. In reality, we were two ambitious people using each other. Their functional marriage changed after Maxwell's skiing accident 6 years ago. 3 surgeries and months of rehabilitation had disconnected him from daily operations. Vanessa stepped in as acting CEO, he continued. By the time I returned, several major acquisitions had been completed, including Ridgeline. And you didn't review those transactions? Eliza asked. Superficially, the documentation Vanessa presented showed standard acquisitions, struggling companies purchased at market value, restructured for efficiency. But that wasn't the case with Ridgeline. No, I discovered the truth 6 months ago when reviewing historical metrics. Ridgeline's collapse wasn't natural. It was engineered through stock manipulation, regulatory issues, and strategic leaks. And Vanessa orchestrated this. With several board members loyal to her family, Reed Innovations acquired Ridgeline for pennies, stripped valuable patents, then abandoned pension obligations and medical benefits. People like my grandmother lost everything, Eliza said quietly. Yes, when I discovered what happened, I launched an investigation to document everything before going public. We identified every affected employee, including Eleanor Montgomery. Maxwell explained how Eleanor had saved the Reed estate during his father's financial collapse. While young Maxwell was away at boarding school, she managed the remaining staff without pay and even used her savings to keep utilities connected. When I returned and found the estate intact, I assumed my father had managed one last responsible act before abandoning us, Maxwell said bitterly. In reality, it was your grandmother who preserved what little legacy remained. More remarkably, Eleanor had been the anonymous investor who provided crucial funding for Maxwell's first company. She used her late husband's life insurance, invested through a lawyer who approached me when traditional funders wouldn't take a chance on a 22-year-old dropout. Maxwell's voice softened. She never claimed the returns, which would have been substantial. Why wouldn't she tell you? Eliza asked. According to Mrs. Harlow, Eleanor believed in me but didn't want me to feel obligated. She said my success would be reward enough. The revelations settled between them. How Eleanor Montgomery had helped build the very empire that later, through corruption she couldn't have foreseen, contributed to her demise. The irony is unbearable, Maxwell said quietly. And now Vanessa is trying to gain control before you can expose what happened. The board meeting tomorrow is critical. If they grant her conservatorship, she'll bury everything. I've prepared documents transferring my voting shares to a trust that will compensate all Ridgeline victims and fund medical research. Everything is ready except my testimony, which is why you need to be strong enough to attend, Eliza concluded. Dr. Lawrence believes a single treatment of the experimental protocol could stabilize me enough, but won't administer it without my medical proxy's approval. Her professional training battled with personal involvement. The ethics were complicated, but a patient's autonomy deserved respect, especially when aligned with justice. I'll approve it, she decided, but I'm monitoring it personally. As the treatment was administered, Eliza remembered something. The brooch. You said it disappeared from my room the night before I left. Mrs. Harlow found it in the observatory after your departure. I never took it off, Eliza said slowly. Someone must have taken it from my room, then planted it after I was gone. Vanessa, Maxwell concluded grimly. Another manipulation. The realization that Vanessa had invaded her space and stolen a family heirloom ignited cold anger in Eliza. This wasn't just corporate maneuvering, it was personal violation. The treatment concluded successfully. Dr. Lawrence reviewed the results with optimism. Remarkable improvement in the markers. With consistent treatment, there's genuine hope for remission. After Lawrence departed, Eliza sat beside Maxwell's bed, the silver brooch cool in her palm. The jewelry now held layers of meaning. Her connection to her grandmother, the unexpected link to Maxwell, evidence of Vanessa's manipulation, and a symbol of justice delayed but perhaps not denied. Maxwell stirred, opening his eyes to find her there. Without words, she pinned the brooch to his hospital gown, a silent pledge of alliance in the battle ahead. Maxwell insisted on returning to the Reed mansion before the board meeting. I won't face them from a hospital bed, he declared as Eliza helped him into a tailored suit that hung slightly loose on his frame. Image matters with these people. Dr. Lawrence objected strenuously, but Maxwell's determination won out. Monitor him constantly, Lawrence instructed Eliza as the private ambulance prepared for departure. If his oxygen saturation drops below 94%, bring him back immediately. The journey felt like a military operation, security vehicles preceding and following the ambulance, medical equipment carefully transferred, medication schedules meticulously maintained. Through it all, Maxwell reviewed documents on his tablet, occasionally dictating instructions to his legal team via secure calls. Eliza watched his transformation with professional admiration and personal concern. The vulnerable patient had receded, replaced by the strategic businessman preparing for battle. Yet she noticed the tremor in his hands, the careful way he managed his breathing when pain flared. Your determination is impressive, she observed as they approached the estate. But you're still recovering from a cardiac event. I've waited my entire career to do something that actually matters, Maxwell replied without looking up from his tablet. I'm not letting Vanessa take that from me. The mansion appeared unchanged, yet felt entirely different to Eliza as she crossed the threshold. Mrs. Harlow greeted them with unconcealed relief, her usual stoicism cracking slightly. The legal team is assembled in the library, sir. Mrs. Reed is expected to arrive within the hour. Maxwell nodded, then turned to Eliza. I need 30 minutes with the lawyers alone. Then I'd like you to join us. As your nurse? She asked. As the granddaughter of Eleanor Montgomery, he answered. Your presence matters to the narrative. While Maxwell met with his team, Eliza found herself drawn to the music room. The grand piano stood silent, dust covers removed as if in expectation of use. She ran her fingers across the keys without pressing them, remembering the moments of connection she'd shared with Maxwell in this space. He asked for sheet music yesterday. Eliza turned to find Mrs. Harlow in the doorway, a leather portfolio in her hands. I found these in storage, the housekeeper continued, approaching the piano. Mrs. Reed's personal collection. Chopin mostly. She placed the portfolio on the piano, then hesitated. My mother worked here before me, she said unexpectedly. She knew your grandmother well. They were friends. I didn't realize. Eleanor was respected by everyone in this house. She held things together when no one else could. Mrs. Harlow's usually impassive face softened slightly. She spoke of you often, her brilliant granddaughter studying nursing. She was immensely proud. Before Eliza could respond, the mansion's atmosphere shifted palpably. The front door opened, and Vanessa's voice carried through the foyer, imperious, demanding, shocked. What is he doing here? He should be hospitalized. Eliza moved quickly toward the library, intercepting Vanessa in the hallway. Their gazes locked in silent recognition of the stakes. Ms. Winters, Vanessa acknowledged coldly. Still overstepping professional boundaries, I see. Mrs. Reed, Eliza responded evenly. Just doing my job, ensuring Mr. Reed's well-being. Your services are no longer required. The board is appointing me as Maxwell's conservator this afternoon. I've already arranged for a specialized care team. That decision hasn't been made yet, Eliza countered. Something dangerous flickered in Vanessa's eyes. You have no idea what you're involved in. This isn't some romantic drama where the nurse saves the billionaire. This is business, my business, and you're interfering with relationships and deals established decades before you arrived. Is that what Eleanor Montgomery did too? Interfere with your business? Vanessa's composure fractured momentarily. What do you know about that? Enough, Eliza replied simply. The library doors opened before Vanessa could respond. Maxwell stood in the doorway, leaning slightly on his cane but radiating authority. Vanessa, right on time for your undoing. The board meeting convened via secure video conference at precisely 2 p.m. Maxwell sat at the head of the library table, flanked by his legal team, while Eliza monitored his vitals discreetly. Vanessa positioned herself opposite, her own attorneys projecting confident smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The board chairman appeared on the main screen, 12 other members visible in smaller windows. This emergency session addresses the petition by Mrs. Vanessa Reed for conservatorship over Mr. Maxwell Reed and his business interests, citing health concerns and diminished capacity. Maxwell allowed Vanessa to present her case first. She spoke compellingly about his declining health, erratic decision-making, and need for protection from opportunistic caregivers, her gaze flicking meaningfully toward Eliza. She presented medical records highlighting the seriousness of his condition and statements from former staff about his increasingly irrational behavior. When her presentation concluded, the chairman turned to Maxwell. Mr. Reed, do you wish to respond to these claims? Not personally, Maxwell replied, surprising everyone. I'd like to introduce Eleanor Montgomery's granddaughter, Eliza Winters, who will speak on my behalf. Vanessa's expression darkened as Eliza took the position beside Maxwell. The silver brooch gleamed on her lapel, catching the afternoon light streaming through library windows. Board members, Eliza began. I'm here both as Mr. Reed's medical proxy and as a representative of those harmed by the Ridgeline Pharmaceuticals acquisition. My grandmother worked for the Reed family for 15 years after losing her career in healthcare during that corporate takeover. She outlined the investigation Maxwell had conducted, presenting evidence of document falsification, offshore accounts, and the systematic dismantling of Ridgeline orchestrated without his knowledge. Mr. Reed isn't suffering from diminished capacity, she concluded. He's experiencing a long-overdue expansion of conscience, one that certain parties find financially inconvenient. The board meeting stretched into evening as evidence was presented, challenged, and verified. Through it all, Maxwell remained focused despite evident fatigue. When his hand trembled while reaching for water, Eliza's fingers closed supportively over his, a gesture not lost on the observing board members. 6 months after the board meeting that changed everything, Maxwell stood at the observatory window, watching stars emerge over Newport's coastline. His body had responded remarkably to the experimental treatment. Not a complete cure, but the doctors now spoke of years rather than months. The cane remained a necessity, but he'd regained weight and color. The business press called it a miraculous recovery. Maxwell called it motivation. The board had unanimously rejected Vanessa's conservatorship petition once the evidence was presented. The Securities and Exchange Commission investigation that followed had been swift and devastating. Vanessa and 3 board members now faced federal charges, their assets frozen pending trial. Maxwell heard familiar footsteps on the spiral staircase and turned to see Eliza, still dressed in the professional attire she'd worn to the hospital that morning. She'd returned to part-time work at Newport Community, balancing patient care with her role in overseeing the Ridgeline Victims Compensation Fund established from Maxwell's personal fortune. The Wilson family received their settlement today, she announced, joining him at the telescope. Their daughter can finally get the specialized care she needs. Eleanor would be proud of what you've accomplished, Maxwell said softly. What we've accomplished, Eliza corrected. The silver brooch gleamed on her lapel, no longer just a remembrance of the past, but a symbol of justice restored. Their relationship had evolved deliberately, cautiously. Maxwell had insisted she maintain her professional life and independence, while he focused on rebuilding his companies with transparency and ethical governance. They'd grown together in the process, their connection deepening through shared purpose rather than crisis. "I have something to show you," Maxwell said, adjusting the telescope. "Tonight's the perfect viewing opportunity." Eliza bent to look through the eyepiece, seeing a faint but distinct star. "What am I looking at?" Maxwell handed her an official certificate. "As of today, that star is registered as Eleanor Montgomery." Emotion tightened Eliza's throat as she read the documentation. "So she'll always be watching over us." "As she did throughout her life," Maxwell replied. "She saw something in me worth believing in when I was just a reckless young man with ambition. I only wish I'd known while she was alive." "She knew," Eliza said with certainty. "She kept every newspaper article about your success in a scrapbook I found after she passed. She followed your career closely, even after what happened with Ridgeline." Maxwell's expression softened with wonder. "She had every reason to hate me." "She understood something I'm still learning," Eliza replied. "That people are more than their worst mistakes or their greatest achievements." She saw the whole person. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken meaning. Since her return to the mansion, they'd carefully maintained appropriate boundaries, professional respect transitioning gradually to friendship, then to something deeper neither had fully named. Maxwell moved to a small cabinet built into the observatory wall, one Eliza had never noticed before. "I've been waiting for the right moment," he said, retrieving a velvet box. "Tonight feels right." He opened it to reveal not jewelry as she'd expected, but an antique key. "This is the original key to the observatory, crafted in 1891, Maxwell explained. "My great-grandfather gave it to his wife as a symbol of granting her access to his innermost sanctuary." He held it out to Eliza. "I'd like you to have it." "Maxwell, I don't know how much time I have in this world," he continued, his voice steadier than it had been in months. "The treatment is working, but nothing is guaranteed. What I do know is that I want to spend whatever time I have building something meaningful with you." With effort, he lowered himself to one knee, still holding the key. "Eliza Winters, you've seen me at my worst, and somehow found something worth believing in. You've taught me that true value isn't measured in empires built, but in lives touched and moments shared." From his pocket, he produced a small platinum ring set with a sapphire that captured the deep blue of the night sky. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, for however long or short our journey may be?" Tears blurred Eliza's vision as she helped him to his feet, wrapping her arms around him. "Yes," she whispered against his chest. "1,000 times yes." Under the silent witness of stars, they sealed their commitment with a kiss that promised not just a future together, but a legacy that would outlive them both. The following morning, as sunlight bathed Newport in golden hues, they sat in the garden discussing plans to convert the mansion's east wing into a research center for rare diseases, funding treatments for patients without resources. "We'll need to hire a director," Maxwell noted, sketching rough plans on his tablet. "Someone with both medical expertise and administrative experience." Dr. Lawrence mentioned an oncologist at Johns Hopkins who might be interested, Eliza suggested, her grandmother's brooch catching the light as she leaned forward. The silver piece would soon have a place of honor in the research center's lobby, displayed alongside a portrait of Eleanor Montgomery. Her quiet influence would continue through a foundation built on compassion rather than profit. In the master bedroom, architectural plans showed modifications underway, the austere space transforming into a warm home designed for two people facing an uncertain future with shared courage. On the nightstand beside medications and medical schedules sat a framed photograph from their private wedding ceremony in the observatory. It captured them surrounded by stars, the silver brooch pinned to Eliza's simple dress, Maxwell's hand steady as it held hers. The image embodied their journey. Two people from different worlds, connected by loss and healing, building something beautiful from broken pieces. Not a fairy tale ending, but something far more valuable, a real beginning.